Oh, hello there. It looks like we're live. Let me put the microphone close to me, which will probably screw everything up, but hey. For those who are watching it live, I know most people watch them later, but if you are live, let me know if everything sounds okay. Let me see if I can close that. Yeah, good enough. So today I want to talk more about the LP and what it means because it was on this day that Columbia Records put out the first LP right in 1947. And, or was it 48? Let me double check that. It was either 47 or 48. Dee-dee-dee. Dee-dee-dee. It's live TV, folks. Hmm. 48. Okay, I don't know if I was right the first or the second time, but that doesn't matter. So the LP and why it's important? Well, it relates to a concept wherein things external to musical composition influence profoundly the way that music is composed. Most of these things are forms of technology. Others are things like architecture. So let's just go into them a bit. And let's start with the 19th century, which in many ways was when music as we really know it came into being, although there are important antecedents. The biggest change that happened in music between the end of the 18th century and the middle of the 19th century was that music, professional music, art music, as it was called at the time, classical music, as it later came to be known in Europe and North America and related societies, it became professionalized. It became something that was sold to consumers. Now, to understand this, you have to see and understand what came before it. What came before it were two things. You had professional music, art music, that was generally played for the great and good, for the European aristocracy and similar types of folks. So, hence, we have the term chamber music, because much music was played literally in the chambers of a great aristocratic manner. Now, did regular people have music too? Well, of course they did. This was folk music, the kind of music that would have been played at a village square or a town hall or a pub or a saloon or a local gathering place. But the people who play, or of course, music played in your own home, which was probably not like that of a grand aristocrat, but still music played in the home environment by you, by your family, by your friends, etc. Now, what all of these folkish traditions had in common is that it wasn't really a professionalized type of music. The people weren't paid for their music, and let alone doing it full time. They may have been paid in a bit of booze if they were doing it at a speakeasy pub or saloon. If it were a family get together, you might be paid in a bit of chicken or pork or beef or anything else that you might desire. And this schism lasted until the late 19th century, but by the early and really the mid 19th century, the era of Wagner, the kind of music that was really for small aristocratic groups, whether in very small concert halls or in their aristocratic homes, this music went out into the world, and the grand concert hall was starting to get born. Professional orchestras, professional opera companies were becoming the rule rather than the exception. And as I've said in a stream from a few weeks ago, Richard Wagner, the great composer, was the man largely responsible for this professionalization and democratization and mass marketing of music. The idea that you would build grand concert halls and opera houses, sell tickets where incredibly talented, disciplined, professionalized professional musicians would play. This was something that Wagner really helped to streamline across Europe. There were hints of it before, particularly in Paris, but Wagner made it a generally pan European phenomenon. And from there was no looking back. Orchestras got bigger, the instruments began to be made better so that it took less of a strain to produce a beautiful sound. New instruments were being invented, like the saxophone, which didn't really penetrate European classical music, but became a huge part of military music, concert music, and later in America, jazz music. Things like the Wagner tuba became very important in late Germanic Romantic music. This was an instrument that Wagner invented to fill in the sort of registers between the French horn and the traditional tuba to give the sound of the orchestra that much fuller of a low mid-range type of sound. And so these are examples of how circumstance outside of the music world changed music, namely the large concert halls. Because as concert halls became bigger, orchestras needed to become bigger and better. And they most certainly did throughout the 19th century. And then you get the great orchestras that sprung up everywhere by the end of that century or the turn of the 20th. Think the Berlin Philharmonic, the Vienna Philharmonic, the earliest one, that was from the 1840s, the Concertgebouw of the late 19th century, the New York Philharmonic, Philadelphia, and Chicago, my favorite three from America, especially at that time. And so again, the architecture of these halls helped to change the way music was composed. It got bigger, it got longer. Why did it get longer? Because one, the musicians could handle it, and two, if you're going to charge people to go to these grand halls, you want them to get their money's worth. Now, the other great change that happened at the end of the 19th century was the advent of the self-playing instrument. And this was hugely important for the professionalization of non-classical music. It helped classical musicians, classical composers, and classical performers sell their wares as well, because obviously the composer composes the music, and someone needs to program the self-playing instrument. In the case of the player piano or the self-playing organ, it would be done with rolls, where a pianist or an organist would sit down at a mechanical instrument that would record what the person was playing onto these rolls, and when you played them back at the person's player piano in their home or their restaurant or their hotel lobby, it would be a replica of what the pianist was playing, and they sounded remarkably good. It was high fidelity long before you had recorded sound with high fidelity, because you had a real instrument, a real piano or a real organ that was mechanically playing what someone had programmed it to play. Of course, early recorded sound came around at the same time. It was actually less popular than player pianos because it didn't sound as good. I'm talking specifically about the Edison cylinder, these early primitive cylinder recordings. But once that genie got out of the bottle, it was only a matter of time before recordings improved in terms of their fidelity. Now, this all led to what I call the birth of pop music. And you could really say that in some ways, even before these things, the popularity of sheet music was something that transformed the folk music into pop music, because it became professionalized. Composers got paid. Huge companies came up and grew that were printing and distributing and selling the sheet music. Many of them were involved in printing out these piano rolls, and you would buy them to put in the player piano at your home or at your hotel lobby or wherever. And some of the most popular genres at this time were things like ragtime. And one of my favorite sort of neo ragtime composers, performers, and historians, Foundering, check him out on X. He talks about this a lot. So definitely check him out on that. He, pardon me, is the authority on that. Now, don't worry, we're going to get to the LP. So, cylinder recordings eventually gave way to shellac discs. And eventually, the stuff that was being programmed onto those discs, recorded onto them by the mid 1920s, was being done electronically rather than purely mechanically, otherwise known as acoustic recordings. The electric recordings using the electric microphone, again, huge leap forward, as Chairman Mao might have said, in terms of the fidelity of this stuff. Now, the problem with these shellac discs is that they were too short to contain a full symphony, let alone a full opera. And so we had the advent of something called the album, whereby multiple 78 RPM shellac discs were put in a little book that literally looked like a photo album, hence the name. And so, well, you had singles where you'd have a song on either side or a couple songs on either side, depending on the length. You also had albums, which were multiple single discs that were, in the album. And those were mainly used for, like I said, symphonies, operas, soundtracks, and collections of songs by popular artists. And therein lies the key to what happened in 1948. See, I told you we'd get back to the crux of the matter, because in 1948 the LP came out, the long playing record, and this was meant to be a replacement for the albums. So no more did you have to have multiple records just to have a recording of a Beethoven symphony. You could have the average length symphony all on one disc. This was revolutionary. And of course, this is nothing to say about the fact that even in the old mono days of the 1940s, the sound quality of the LP was exceptionally better to that of the Shellac 78 disc. Now, the LP became very popular, so much so that it killed off the old 78 album. And the term, though, remained. People call to this day a long playing record an album, even though the term applied to that literal album of records in a book type of casing that you would have with the 78s. But it just shows you that once a piece of language is applied to a new technology, subsequent newer technologies often borrow the word, even though at that point it's kind of lost its original meaning. So the LP record, the modern album, was here and here to stay. And in most of the first world, by the late 50s, 78s were gone. They lost it a bit longer in the third world. Now, a question that came up is that as artists, what do we do? Well, if you're an orchestral conductor, or more appropriately, a producer working for a record company putting out classical music, the choice was easy. Symphonies on a disc, operas on a disc or two. Same thing goes for string quartets, a series of overtures, a suite of music. You get the idea. In the pop music world, the album presented more of a challenge because pop music was still at this time very much a singles based genre. And at around the same time as the LP, you have a new high fidelity singles format, the ubiquitous 45 RPM record. But again, what about these albums? What were the pop singers, the pop artists to do? Now, the easy solution was just a collection of songs, and these did sell. But there was still something that was missing, because a lot of these songs ended up being what we call filler. There were the singles that were then on the album, and maybe a few other decent songs, and then some where the artists were just sort of going through the motions. It wasn't until 1955 that the panacea of the pop album came into the world. This sounds very like Charlton Heston on that old hill, assuming that hill hasn't been bombed. Am I allowed to say that on YouTube? I don't know. I don't care. So in 1955, it was a watershed year because it was the first year of the concept album. And I would very strongly argue that the concept album helped the LP record to sustain itself for a very long period. Think of it, 48, so 58, 68, 78, 88, into the 90s. Around 50 years, this was the go-to format for at least home listening. I get that cassettes by the 80s started to sell a bit more, mainly because of cars, but for the home, the LP was generally the de facto listening format. I know in the 50s and 60s, you had reel-to-reel tapes, which were of higher quality, but that I think I've done on a different stream, and I'll certainly explore that more on a future stream. So what was this first concept album? Well, it was Frank Sinatra, one of his finest albums, and it was called In the Wee Small Hours, produced and arranged and conducted by one of his longtime collaborators, Nelson Riddle. And this was the beginning of the idea that even when you're dealing with pop music, an album can be a cohesive artistic statement, whether it's based around a lyrical theme, an emotional theme, a musical theme, or anything else. Now, albums at this time, there were lots of albums in the realm of, let's say, novelty music that had themes like jungle drums, a trip to, Samoa, Russian balalaikas, and of course, the classical music industry adapted by creating, some would call them compilation albums, others would call them concept albums, where an orchestra would play generally short pieces all around the same theme. One of my favorites was from 1959. It was the great Spanish conductor Ataulfo Argenta conducting music of his country, and the album was called España on Decca, aka London in North America. And then, of course, at the end of the 50s, RCA Living Stereo put out a great call it a concept album, call it a compilation album called Festival with the Chicago Symphony, and that was conducted at the time by their leader, Fritz Reiner. But these came after In the Wee Small Hours, and I would make an argument that the idea of the pop concept album was always distinct from the thematic classical album of overtures or of a couple suites of music. So, in my view, it was Frank Sinatra who blew the doors of opportunity open to the concept album. And I would argue that this created a lot of longevity for the album in general, because it showed that the album had possibilities to create kinds of music that wouldn't have been possible to develop within a 3-minute single on a 45 record or a 3-minute single on an old-fashioned 78 shellac disc. And in this sense, I would argue that while, yes, not every LP was a concept album, the key to what the LP did for pop music laid in the foundations of the concept album. And of course, Sinatra was the first, but he was no means done by then. Almost every album from there on out by Sinatra was some sort of concept album. Think 1957's Where Are You? Think Come Fly With Me, All About Travel from 1958. And this continued on in the early 60s when Sinatra broke from his label Capitol, his second label. His first was Columbia. He had one of the first LPs on Columbia. And then in the early 60s, he formed his own label, Reprise. And I know that a lot of Sinatra purists disagree with me on this. I did a video on it. I think Sinatra's best records were on the Reprise label. And one of the very first on that label was a concept album, one of my favorite concept albums of all time, and this was called Sinatra and Strings, an absolute monster, beautiful album released at the very beginning of 1962. And this was arranged by a man who became a frequent Sinatra collaborator, one of the great arrangers of all time. I've done videos on him, the great Don Costa. Now, the theme of Sinatra and Strings were ballads, typically slow ballads with a lush orchestral string section backing him by Don Costa. And everything about the album was perfect. The arrangements, the song selection, the orchestral performance, the production, Sinatra's voice at its peak, in my point of view. And he wasn't done there, because another one of my favorite albums came out later that year on Reprise, All Alone. And the theme here was loneliness. And you had so many different themes. You had the concert Sinatra. The concept there was it would be recorded on 35 millimeter magnetic film on a film soundstage. So it's got a very sort of big, different kind of sound. September of My Years from 65, another one of my favorite concept albums, all about aging and life and these sorts of themes. You've got Moonlight Sinatra from 66, all about moon. Songs all about the moon. The World We Knew, a song, an album about reminiscence from 57. Cycles, an album about observing life, about the philosophy of the everyman. Another Don Costa arrangement from 68. Then you had Watertown, a story-based concept album that tells the story of a small town and leaving to go to the city, a divorced family at the heart of this theme. And Bob Gaudio from the Four Seasons composed all the music to this, and the list goes on. You could say his collaborations with Antonio Carlos Jobim were concept albums. An American pop singer who sort of cut his teeth in an era where jazz dominated pop, adopted a Brazilian bossa nova flair, and the list goes on. So Sinatra never let himself down when it comes to concept albums, because from 55 onwards, I would argue that most of his albums were in fact concept albums of one variety or another. Now, this opened up the doors to so many other types of artists. And one of the artists that really helped bring the concept album and the album in general into the rock and roll world were the Beach Boys. And I've been talking a lot about them lately because of Brian Wilson's death at the age of 82. Now, People will argue, but I would say that Pet Sounds was really the first time that rock and roll found a place on an album. Yes, there were good rock and roll albums before this, but unlike the classic pop of Frank Sinatra, rock and roll remained a singles dominated genre until 1966 when Pet Sounds came out. When Pet Sounds came out, it demonstrated that musicians from a rock background were able to create the kinds of sophisticated musical themes, sophisticated arrangements, and sophisticated concepts that could tie an album together as a cohesive piece of art, every bit as successfully as the stuff Sinatra and his peers in the classic pop world were doing. So Pet Sounds had an interesting conceptual theme about a young man, or young men in general, facing the world. Musically, there were so many new instruments introduced that weren't necessarily familiar to rock and roll audiences: the harmonium, the accordion, and you had many production techniques that made instruments like organ and piano and guitar, instruments familiar to rock audiences, sound very different than they would normally sound. And Pet Sounds sort of gave everyone in rock both the excuse and the inspiration to explore their conceptual side. Freak Out was another very important album that was recorded after Pet Sounds, but around not too much after. And this was not Frank Zappa's finest album, as Zappa himself would say. His albums got better with age because he was able to literally afford to hire much more virtuosic musicians, which Zappa said he always wanted to do. I don't know if I called Zappa Sinatra there. We're having a frank frenzy today. But Freak Out was nevertheless important. It was a double album, the first real rock and roll double album, and yes, a concept album. Of course, Sgt. Pepper's by the Beatles was very much influenced by Pet Sounds. The Beatles themselves said that. The Stones got into the game. You could argue that Piper at the Gates of Dawn, the first Pink Floyd album, was bucolic psychedelia, a concept in and of itself. One of the great concept albums ever in 1967, Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues, a combination of a prog rock band, orchestra, and the story of the day of the everyman from dawn to evening, his nights in white satin after that. And from there on out, the whole music world was pretty much concept crazy. In the 70s, it seemed like everyone and their brother had a concept album. But before we get to the 70s, I want to give huge props to the Kinks, who did a lot of concept albums in the mid 60s all the way up until the mid 70s. They don't get a lot of the credit that they deserve for doing that. But you had The Who with their rock operas, first a quick one while he's away, then Tommy, Quadrophenia. Those are concept albums. What's Going On, you could argue, was the first soul concept album. You could argue that some of Stevie Wonder's great albums, like Talking Book and Songs in the Key of Life, were concept albums. David Bowie, loads of concept albums, probably most famously The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, the top-selling concept album ever. Every album they did after that until Roger Waters left was a concept album. ELO's El Dorado was a concept album. Parliament got into it with the Clones of Dr. Funkenstein, which was a rock opera, and before that, The Mothership Connection, all about funking it out in space. Zappa came out with many concept albums throughout his life, whether it's Joe's Garage, You Are What You Is, or the great opera Thing Fish. Sapphire, we all love it. I love that show as well. Country acts got into it. Willie Nelson did concept albums. Styx, Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation, you could argue, was a concept album. At this point, by the time you're in the 70s, again, it became so much so that it became almost a Spinal Tap cliche that everyone had to do a concept album. And in Spinal Tap's case, they took it to the penultimate extreme and they did a jazz rock fusion concept album that was known as Jazz Odyssey, written by the bass player. So I would say that concept albums helped give a life and an extended life to the album. And it's one of the strongest examples of a piece of technology changing the way that music is written. Instead of thinking of music in the pop world as songs or short instrumental compositions, it pardon me, gave the pop world, pop composers, pop performers, the impetus to create music that was round about between 40 and 45 minutes of length, because that's the average length of a single LP, both sides considered. And it said, right, let's compose a piece within these time constraints. That didn't exist before. Before, you had the classical world, which was composed because its origins were before recorded music. Time constraints weren't really an issue. It was really just based on the endurance of the musicians, or you had the 3-minute singable song. The LP created something that sits in between, the 45 minutes of cohesive music. And Dark Side of the Moon was composed with that in mind. The great Sinatra concept albums, Days of Future Past, were composed with that in mind. And yes, you had your double concept albums, whether it's Freak Out or Tales from Topographic Oceans or Pink Floyd's The Wall, the most successful double album concept album of all time. But I think you get the idea. So long live the LP, and we cannot say that without equally saying long live the concept album. As always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.